I agreed to sign the document because walking away would have cost me my job, my health insurance, and the quiet life I had spent 15 years building. It was a Tuesday morning, 8:40 a.m., and the conference room still smelled like burnt coffee. Everyone else looked relaxed. I wasn't. My pen slipped once and left a small ink mark on the margin. No one noticed. I signed anyway. What I did not know then was that this signature would be the last true thing I believed about myself. I signed the document because refusing would have cost me my job, my health insurance, and the quiet life I had spent 15 years building. It was a Tuesday morning, 8:40 a.m., and the conference room still smelled like burnt coffee and lemon disinfectant. The blinds were half open. A thin strip of winter light cut across the table and stopped at my hands. Everyone else looked relaxed, jackets draped over chairs, phones face down. I wasn't. My pen slipped once and left a small blue mark on the margin. No one noticed. I signed anyway. I had learned, over time, how to make myself invisible in rooms like that. Keep my shoulders still, nod at the right moments, speak only when asked. The document was slid toward me by a man I had known for 6 years, a man who used my first name only when other people were listening. "Standard procedure," he said, tapping the paper twice with his finger. The clock on the wall clicked. I could hear it over the low hum of the HVAC. I could hear my own breathing, measured and slow, the way I had taught myself to breathe when things felt off, but I could not afford to say so. When the meeting ended, everyone stood at once. Chairs scraped back. Someone joked about lunch. I gathered my notebook and slipped the pen into my bag. The ink mark stared up at me like a bruise. I folded the signed document, slid it into a manila envelope, and handed it back. "Thank you," he said, already looking past me. The door swung open. Cold air rushed in from the hallway. It smelled like copy paper and perfume. I work in procurement for a regional transit authority in the Southwest. Not glamorous, stable, the kind of job people stop noticing once you do it well enough. I had started there fresh out of college, learned the rules, learned the exceptions, learned who mattered and who didn't. I learned how to keep my head down. I learned how to say yes without meaning it and no without saying it. Over the years, the work had become a rhythm: purchase orders, vendor calls, compliance checklists, deadlines that moved but never disappeared. It paid my mortgage. It paid for my mother's prescriptions when her insurance didn't. It paid for the kind of quiet that looks boring from the outside and feels like safety from the inside. That morning, back at my desk, I logged into my computer and answered emails. My calendar chimed. I dismissed it. Outside my window, the parking lot was already filling up. The bus depot across the street coughed awake, diesel engines turning over one by one. I liked that sound. It meant the city was moving. It meant I was part of something larger, even if no one knew my name. At 10:15, my phone buzzed with a message from my sister. "Did you hear from Mom yet?" I typed back. "Later. In a meeting." I wasn't lying. I just wasn't telling the whole truth. I had learned to ration truth the way other people ration money. Spend it where it counts, save the rest. By noon, the ink mark had dried into a thin crescent on the edge of the paper in my bag. I ate lunch at my desk, a turkey sandwich, warm from my car, mustard bleeding through the bread. I scrolled through vendor invoices and flagged a discrepancy. Nothing dramatic, just a line item that didn't belong. I flagged it, sent a note, moved on. That was my job. Catch the small things before they became big things. Fix problems quietly. At 2:30, the man from the meeting stopped by my desk. He leaned on the partition with one elbow, casual, like we were friends. "All good?" he asked. I nodded. "All good." He smiled and walked away. I watched his reflection in the glass as he went. He didn't look back. By the time I left the office, the sun was already low. Winter days are like that here, short and sharp. I drove home along the frontage road, passing the same gas station I always passed, the same billboard advertising personal injury lawyers. I turned into my neighborhood and parked in my driveway. The house looked the same as it always did: beige, stucco, blue door, a small crack in the concrete I kept meaning to fix. Inside, the air was cool. I dropped my bag on the kitchen counter and kicked off my shoes. The envelope slid out and landed near the sink. I didn't pick it up right away. I washed my hands instead, watching the water run clear, listening to the pipes knock once before settling. When I finally opened the envelope, I didn't read the document again. I had already read it 3 times that morning. I folded it back the way it had been and set it in the drawer with my tax returns. That night, I slept badly. I woke up at 3:12 a.m. to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. A number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. It stopped. Started again. Stopped. When I finally listened in the morning, there was no message. Just breathing, faint, and then a click. The next day felt normal. Too normal. I made coffee. I drove to work. I logged in. At 9:05, an email came in, marked urgent. It was from accounts payable. A vendor was asking about a hold on a payment. I checked the system. The hold had my initials next to it. That made sense. I had flagged it. What didn't make sense was the note attached to the hold. It wasn't mine. The phrasing was wrong. Too casual. A joke where there shouldn't be one. I stood up and walked to the window. The buses were lining up across the street, doors opening and closing in a practiced rhythm. A driver waved to someone I couldn't see. I turned back to my screen and reread the note. Still wrong. I opened the audit trail. The timestamp was from 11:07 p.m., the night before. I was asleep then. I knew I was. I checked my calendar. No remote access scheduled. No after-hours maintenance. I closed the window and reopened it. The note didn't change. At 11:30, my manager called me into his office. He closed the door behind me. "We've had some questions," he said, folding his hands on the desk. "About your process." He used the word "your" carefully, like it might break if he pressed too hard. I sat down. The chair was lower than it should have been. My knees felt too close to the desk. He slid a printed email toward me. The ink was fresh. The font was familiar. The words were not. I told him the truth, the small, careful version. I told him I hadn't written that note. I told him I had flagged the discrepancy during business hours. I told him I had signed a document the day before. He nodded at all the right places. He asked me to leave the envelope with him. I did. When I stood up to go, my bag caught on the corner of the chair and tipped. My pen rolled across the carpet and stopped against the wall. No one bent to pick it up. I did. By the end of the week, the questions had multiplied. The discrepancies were no longer isolated. They were patterned, always adjacent to my work, always late, always just plausible enough to be a mistake. People started saying my name differently, slower, with a pause. My inbox filled with meetings. My calendar chimed and chimed and chimed. I stopped dismissing it. On Friday afternoon, as I packed up to leave, I noticed something else. A sticky note on my monitor, yellow, square. My handwriting, but heavier, like I had pressed too hard. It said, "We'll talk Monday." I don't use sticky notes. I never have. I peeled it off and stuck it to the inside of my notebook. The adhesive made a soft tearing sound. It felt loud in the empty office. As I turned off my computer, the screen reflected my face back at me. I looked the same. Same hair pulled back, same jacket, same calm. But something had shifted, just enough to feel it, like a floorboard that dips when you step on it, not enough to fall through, but enough to remember where it is. That night, I opened the drawer with the tax returns and the signed document. I ran my finger over the crease where I had folded it. The ink mark was still there, a small, ordinary thing. I closed the drawer and stood in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the refrigerator kick on and off, listening to the house settle. I told myself the same thing I had told myself for years. I had done the right thing. I had followed the rules. I had paid the price. What I didn't know yet was how quickly rules can be rewritten once your name is already on the page. Before any of this started, my life was built on routines so solid they felt permanent. I woke up at 5:45 every weekday without an alarm. The house was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own thoughts before the day claims them. I brewed a single cup of coffee, black, drank it standing by the kitchen window, and watched the streetlights flick off one by one. By 6:30, I was dressed, hair pulled back, lunch packed. At 7:10, I backed out of the driveway. Every morning, the same motions. I liked it that way. I am 42 years old. I live alone in a modest house on the outskirts of Phoenix, close enough to the city to work, far enough to sleep without sirens. I bought the house on my own 12 years ago, right after a quiet divorce that never made it into anyone else's conversations. No children, no pets, no shared walls, just me, the mortgage, and the steady hum of responsibility. People like to imagine lives like mine as empty. They are wrong. It was full in all the ways that mattered to me. My job had never been a passion, but it was honest. Procurement is invisible when done well. You don't get applause for preventing fraud. You don't get thanked for catching the extra zero before it drains a budget. You get silence. And silence, in a system that chews people up, is a kind of respect. Over the years, I had become someone others leaned on without realizing it. I knew which vendors cut corners. I knew which ones paid on time. I knew which clauses mattered and which ones were just noise. I knew how to keep projects moving without making enemies. I had earned that position slowly, not through charm, through showing up, through fixing problems without advertising them, through taking calls after hours and not billing overtime, through staying late when a bid package was missing one signature and everyone else wanted to go home. I had built a reputation I thought was unbreakable because it wasn't flashy. It was quiet. It was documented. It was real. Outside of work, my life followed the same logic. I paid my bills early. I kept a spreadsheet of expenses. I visited my mother every other Sunday, brought groceries, refilled her pill organizer, sat at the kitchen table while she complained about the neighbors. My sister lived 3 states away and called when she remembered. I didn't resent that. Everyone carries what they can. I carried what I could. Friends came and went, mostly went. I had learned, sometime in my 30s, that friendships built on convenience rarely survive change. The people I once had drinks with after work now had children, schedules, lives that didn't overlap with mine. We sent holiday cards. We liked each other's photos online. That was enough. Loneliness is loud when you fight it. I didn't. I let it be what it was. Space. The relationship that mattered most in my adult life wasn't romantic. It was professional. The transit authority wasn't just my employer. It was the backbone of the city. Thousands of people depended on it every day without thinking about it. Buses ran. Trains ran. Projects expanded. When things worked, no one noticed. When they didn't, everyone noticed. I took pride in being on the side of things working. That was why the document in the conference room had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Not because it was illegal. It wasn't. Not on its face. It was because it shifted accountability. It moved responsibility quietly, away from decisions, and onto signatures. Onto mine. I had told myself that was just how things were done at higher levels. That this was the cost of stability. That this was what grown-ups did. I had said those words before. To myself. To my sister, when she asked why I stayed in a job that never promoted me past a certain point. To my mother, when she worried I was too careful with my life. Careful was how I survived. Careful was how I kept the lights on. Careful was how I slept at night. If someone had asked me, before that Tuesday, who I was, I would have said this. I am a person who follows rules. I am a person who keeps records. I am a person who believes systems can be imperfect but still worth protecting. I believed that if you did your part, the system would do its part too. It was a simple belief, maybe even naive. But it had held up for decades. The first crack in that belief didn't come with drama. It came with paperwork. After the meeting with my manager, after the email and the altered note, I went back to my desk and pulled up old files. I told myself I was just double-checking, just being thorough. I opened purchase orders from the last 6 months. I scanned timestamps. I compared language. I looked for patterns. At first, there was nothing obvious. Then, there was something subtle. A phrasing I recognized, Not as mine, but as borrowed. Someone else's voice wearing my name. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't even tell myself why I was doing it. I just worked. Late that night, at home, I spread printed pages across my dining table. The wood was scratched from years of use. I had planned to refinish it someday. I traced lines with my finger. Dates, numbers, notes that appeared after hours, all under my credentials. I checked my laptop for malware. Nothing. I changed my passwords. I checked access logs. There were entries that shouldn't have been there. Remote access from an IP address I didn't recognize. At times when I was asleep, I told myself there had to be an explanation. IT maintenance, a system glitch, anything but intent. On Thursday, I ran into the man from the meeting in the hallway. He smiled the same way he always did. Asked about my weekend plans. I said I didn't have any. He nodded like that made sense. As he walked away, he said, "You've always been reliable." The word landed wrong. Too deliberate, too rehearsed. That night, my mother called. She had misplaced her insurance card again. I found the number, called on her behalf, sorted it out. She thanked me, told me she didn't know what she'd do without me. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone pressed to my ear and stared at the wall. There was a small dent near the door frame I had never fixed. I had put it there moving furniture by myself years ago. I remembered thinking, at the time, that it was fine, that things don't have to be perfect to work. By Friday morning, my stomach hurt. Not sharply, just a constant pressure. I skipped breakfast. I drank coffee anyway. At work, people were polite in a new way. Careful. Conversations stopped when I approached. Meetings included me, but didn't involve me. My calendar filled with touch base and check-in appointments. Words that meant nothing and everything. I still believed, then, that if I stayed calm, if I stayed factual, things would correct themselves. I believed the truth had weight. That records mattered. That intent could be proven. I believed that because I had always believed it, because that belief had been the spine of my life. What I didn't see yet was how fragile that spine was once someone decided to lean their full weight against it. I went home that Friday and did what I always did. I watered the plants. I took out the trash. I folded laundry and stacked it neatly. I cooked pasta and ate it standing up at the counter. The house was quiet, familiar, safe. I stood there longer than I needed to, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock above the sink. I told myself I was overreacting, that this was stress, that nothing real had happened yet. I told myself that Monday would bring clarity, that systems correct themselves, that good faith is rewarded. I believed that because I had built my entire life on the idea that it had to be true. And I went to bed, still believing it, not knowing that belief was already being used against me. I did not enter my relationship the way people expect when they hear the word relationship. There were no flowers, no dramatic beginnings, no moment I could point to and say, that's when everything changed. It started the way most adult entanglements start, quietly, at a point in my life when I was tired of pretending I didn't want anything at all. I met Daniel at a regional transportation conference in Flagstaff, 3 years before that Tuesday morning. It was a 2-day event in a hotel ballroom that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and overbrewed coffee. I was there to sit on a procurement panel. He was there representing a consulting firm that specialized in compliance oversight. We didn't speak the first day. I noticed him only because he asked a question no one else did. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't showy. It was precise. The kind of question asked by someone who had read the entire packet instead of skimming the summary. That caught my attention. We spoke later that afternoon near the coffee station. He introduced himself. Firm handshake, steady eye contact, no jokes, no forced charm. He asked what I thought of the new federal guidelines. I answered honestly. We disagreed on one point. Neither of us backed down. When the conversation ended, it felt unfinished, in a good way. Over the next few months, our paths crossed again. Emails at first. Professional, boring. Then phone calls that lasted a few minutes longer than necessary. Discussions that drifted from work into logistics of life. He lived in Scottsdale. divorced. One teenage son who lived with his mother most of the year. He traveled often. I worked too much. There was no illusion of romance, just two people acknowledging that the other existed. When he asked me to dinner, it didn't feel like a risk. It felt efficient. We met at a restaurant halfway between our houses, the kind of place where the lighting is dim enough to flatter but not intimate enough to suggest expectations. We talked about work. We talked about how exhausting it was to constantly explain what we did to people who didn't care. He didn't ask why I had never remarried. I didn't ask why his marriage ended. We paid separately without discussion. That became our pattern. Daniel never made promises. That was one of the things I liked about him. He didn't talk about the future unless there was a reason. He didn't pretend feelings were something you could schedule or guarantee. He showed up when he said he would. He left when he said he had to. He never stayed the night. I never asked him to. For someone like me, that felt safe. Our relationship existed in the margins of our lives, not at the center. We didn't post photos. We didn't meet each other's families. He came to my house sometimes, but he never left anything there. No toothbrush, no jacket, just his briefcase, which he kept with him even when we moved to the living room. I found that reassuring. It meant he wasn't careless. It meant he understood boundaries. At least, that's what I told myself. 6 months in, he mentioned a consulting contract he was bidding on with my agency. He brought it up casually, like an afterthought. I remember the moment clearly because it felt slightly wrong, and I ignored that feeling completely. I told him, immediately, that I couldn't be involved. That there were rules. He nodded and said, of course. He said he would work with someone else on his end. He said it didn't change anything between us. I believed him because nothing changed. Not at first. He didn't ask me for information. He didn't ask me for introductions. He didn't ask me to influence anything. He didn't even tell me when his firm won the contract. I heard it through internal channels, the way I heard everything else. I remember feeling a brief, sharp discomfort when I saw his company's name on the list. I told myself that was professional jealousy, or coincidence, or simply the discomfort of overlap. The contract was small. Oversight on a pilot project. Limited scope. Limited duration. Nothing that should have touched my desk. But it did. Gradually. A question here. A clarification there. His firm's invoices came through the system more often than expected. Not large, just frequent. Always just under thresholds that triggered secondary review. I noticed, flagged, moved on. I did not connect it to Daniel. I refused to. I was too careful to do anything else. Outside of work, Daniel remained exactly the same. Calm, reserved, predictable. If anything, he seemed pleased that we never discussed work at home. He called it keeping things clean. I agreed. I prided myself on that cleanliness. The separation between who I was at work and who I was everywhere else had always been my strength. Looking back, I can see how that separation became a blind spot. The night he first stayed late at my house, it felt significant only because it broke our pattern. He had driven up from Tucson unexpectedly after a meeting ran long. It was late. The roads were empty. I offered him the guest room without thinking. He hesitated for half a second, then accepted. In the morning, he left early, before I woke up. His bed was made. The towel was folded. The guest room looked untouched. I told myself that was considerate. There were other small shifts after that. He asked more questions about my workload, about staffing, about internal bottlenecks. I answered in general terms. Anyone in his line of work would ask the same. I told myself that too. He began to complain, gently, about delays on his contract, about bureaucracy, about how difficult it was to get answers from certain departments. He never mentioned names, never mentioned me. I offered sympathy. Nothing more. The truth is, I was proud of how careful we were. Proud that we could navigate complexity without drama. Proud that we weren't the kind of people who blurred lines. I saw us as adults making rational choices in a complicated world. I saw our relationship as evidence that I could have connection without chaos. When my manager mentioned Daniel's firm in passing during a meeting one afternoon, I felt my throat tighten. He said the firm was aggressive. He said they were creative. He laughed. I laughed too. Later, at home, I asked Daniel about it. He shrugged and said that was business, that firms like his were hired to push boundaries, that oversight only worked if someone tested it. I didn't like that answer. I didn't argue. That was my mistake. By the time the altered note appeared under my credentials, Daniel and I had been seeing each other for almost 3 years, long enough that his presence in my life felt natural, normal, safe, long enough that the idea of him being connected to what was happening at work felt absurd, offensive, even. I did not want to believe that the person I trusted most to respect boundaries was the one standing closest to the line. So I didn't. I held on to the version of Daniel I knew. The man who read documents carefully, the man who didn't waste words, the man who valued systems because they created order. I told myself that whatever was happening at work was unrelated. That coincidence was still the simplest explanation. It was easier to believe that the system was failing than to believe the person I had chosen had been watching how it failed all along. And I carried that belief with me into Monday morning, into the meeting that waited on my calendar, still convinced that I understood the rules of the game I was playing. The imbalance did not announce itself. It crept in the way humidity does in the desert, slowly, almost politely, until one day you realize the air feels heavier than it should. There was no single moment I could point to and say, this is where it went wrong. There were only adjustments, small ones, reasonable ones, the kind that made sense if you didn't line them up side by side. After Monday's meeting, my workload shifted in subtle ways. I was asked to support more projects than before, not lead them, not decide, just support. It sounded flattering on paper, collaborative, team-oriented. In practice, it meant my name appeared on more documents without my authority expanding to match. I reviewed, I flagged, I recommended. Others approved. When I noticed this, I told myself it was temporary, restructuring, budget cycles. The agency was always reorganizing itself into new shapes. Titles changed, responsibilities slid around. That was normal. Daniel's firm appeared more often in those supported projects, not always directly, sometimes as a subcontractor, sometimes as an external reviewer, sometimes just copied on emails for awareness. The overlap increased, but never enough to feel deliberate, never enough to justify alarm. When Daniel complained about delays, I stopped offering sympathy and started offering context, general context, publicly available context. I explained timelines, I explained bottlenecks, I explained why things took as long as they did. He listened carefully, asked follow-up questions, thanked me. I told myself that was harmless, educational, even. I did not consider that education is also leverage. At work, my manager began forwarding me emails that had nothing to do with my role. "Can you take a look?" he would ask. "Just to make sure it's clean." Clean was his word for safe, for defensible, for something that would hold up if anyone ever asked questions later. I took pride in that role. I had always been the one who made things clean. I didn't notice when clean started to mean untraceable. The first time I pushed back was over a contract amendment. It was minor, technically, a change in reporting frequency. I flagged it because it altered oversight expectations. My manager waved it off. "It's just paperwork," he said. "The work is the same," I said. Paperwork was the work. He smiled, like you smile at someone being overly cautious. "You're always so thorough," he said. I signed off. At home, Daniel noticed my stress before I did. He brought takeout without asking. He didn't stay late, but he lingered longer, asked how my day had been, not in a casual way, but in a way that suggested he was listening for something specific. I answered honestly but incompletely. I had always done that, with everyone. One night, while I was washing dishes, he leaned against the counter and said, "You carry more than you should." I laughed it off. He said, "You always do." It sounded like admiration. I let it be that. There were other shifts. I started getting copied on emails sent after hours, time-stamped late at night. Decisions made while I slept. I was told they were urgent, that things couldn't wait. I told myself that was why I was included to protect the process. My name became a kind of shield. If it passed through me, it must be legitimate. That belief made me useful. By midweek, I realized I was spending more time explaining decisions I hadn't made than making decisions of my own. People stopped asking for my opinion and started asking for my confirmation. A subtle but important difference. Confirmation suggests agreement. Opinion suggests agency. I gave confirmation because that was what was asked of me. At home, Daniel mentioned that his firm was under pressure, that oversight contracts were competitive, that margins were thin. He didn't ask for help. He never did. He just talked, shared, ventilated. I listened. That was what partners did. I told myself listening wasn't complicity. The normalization happened in layers. First, I accepted extra responsibility without extra authority. Then I accepted extra exposure without extra protection. Then I accepted extra silence where there should have been conversation. Each step felt small enough to justify on its own. There was a moment, late one afternoon, when I almost said something. I was standing in the copy room waiting for a document to print. 2 colleagues were talking behind me, not quietly. One of them mentioned my name. The other said, "She's solid. If she touched it, it's fine." There was relief in that statement. Trust. It should have felt good. Instead, it felt like weight. I walked back to my desk with the papers in my hand and sat there for a long time without opening them. My computer screen dimmed. I didn't move. I thought about the document I had signed, about the ink mark, about how easily my name slid into places I hadn't been. When I told Daniel about the comment that night, he smiled. "That's your reputation," he said. "You've earned it." I asked him, half joking, if he ever worried about carrying someone else's weight. He shrugged. "That's what systems are for," he said. "They distribute responsibility." I should have asked what he meant by that. I didn't. The imbalance became clearest in what I stopped doing. I stopped documenting disagreements in writing. I stopped escalating concerns. I stopped insisting on revisions that slowed things down. Not because I had been told to stop, but because resistance had become inefficient. It took more energy to fight than to comply. And compliance, I told myself, wasn't the same as wrongdoing. That distinction mattered to me. It allowed me to sleep. On Friday, an internal memo went out announcing a streamlining initiative. My department was praised for its flexibility. My name was mentioned. I read it twice, looking for something else beneath the words. There was nothing explicit, just appreciation, just alignment, just momentum. Daniel texted me that evening. "Long week. Want to come over?" I said yes. At his place, everything was neat, minimal, intentional. A life designed to leave little trace. We ate on the couch. He poured me a glass of wine. I don't usually drink on work nights. I did that night. He asked if I trusted him. The question came out of nowhere, casual enough to sound like curiosity. I laughed and said, "Of course." He nodded, satisfied. "Good," he said. "That matters." Later, lying awake in his guest room, I stared at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly, evenly. I told myself the question meant nothing. People asked strange things sometimes. I told myself I was reading too much into it. That was my habit, self-correction. Doubt directed inward, not outward. The next week, the altered notes multiplied. Still subtle, still defensible, still under my credentials. I told myself I would sort it out soon, that I just needed time, that once things stabilized, I would go back and clean up the edges. What I didn't understand yet was that the imbalance had already done its work. By agreeing to carry weight quietly, I had taught everyone around me that I would keep carrying it. By staying reasonable, I had made myself predictable. By believing that normal meant safe, I had helped turn something wrong into something routine. And routine, I was about to learn, is the most dangerous cover of all. Silence did not arrive all at once. It settled in gradually, the way people step back from a sidewalk without realizing they've done it. No one announced it. No one acknowledged it. It simply became the new shape of things. The first sign was how conversations changed when I entered a room. Not stopped, shifted, voices lowered just enough to be polite, jokes finished quickly, topics redirected. I told myself that was normal. People adjusted all the time. I had done it myself, countless times, when someone higher up walked by. This was no different. Except, it felt different. Meetings grew more crowded and less specific. More people, fewer decisions. I would raise a question and it would be met with nods instead of answers. "Let's circle back," someone would say, or "We'll take that offline." Offline never came. My calendar filled with placeholders and follow-ups that led nowhere. Meanwhile, emails continued to go out under my name, approving things I had never seen. When I pointed this out carefully, the response was always the same. Confusion, surprise, mild concern that never sharpened into action. "That's odd," my manager would say. "We'll look into it." And then, nothing would happen. Or worse, something would happen quietly and without me. A note would be corrected, a timestamp adjusted, a version history cleaned up. Each fix erased the trace of the problem along with the problem itself. It was hard to fight something that left no marks. I started documenting things for myself. Not officially, not in the system. In a notebook I kept at home. Dates, times, small discrepancies, who said what, who was copied, who wasn't. It felt paranoid. I didn't like that feeling. I told myself it was temporary, just until I understood what was going on. At work, people remained polite, warm, even. They asked about my mother, about my weekend. They complimented my reliability. They did not ask my opinion. They did not include me in decisions that bore my name. It was as if I had been quietly promoted to mascot, a symbol of diligence, wheeled out when needed, ignored otherwise. The silence extended beyond the office. When I mentioned the situation to a colleague I had trusted for years, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sighed and said, "You've always been so careful." It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't an accusation. It was a way of stepping away. She suggested I take some time off, recharge, let things settle. I nodded and thanked her. I did not take time off. At home, my sister called and asked why my voice sounded tight. I told her I was busy. She told me I worked too much. That was always her conclusion. I let her have it. It was easier than explaining something I didn't fully understand myself. Daniel noticed the change more than anyone else. Or at least, he noticed that I was quieter, less patient. He didn't push. He never did. Instead, he filled the space with reassurance. "These things blow over," he said one evening, pouring wine. "Organizations get weird sometimes." He said it with authority, like someone who had seen it before. I asked him if he had ever felt scapegoated. The word slipped out before I could soften it. He paused for a fraction of a second, then smiled. "That's a strong word," he said. "I wouldn't go that far." He reminded me that systems don't need villains. They just need pressure points. That answer should have bothered me more than it did. The longer the silence lasted, the more isolated I became inside it. There was no clear accusation to defend against, no formal complaint to respond to, just an atmosphere of quiet repositioning. Work flowed around me instead of through me. Decisions were made adjacent to my role, not within it. I was included just enough to be implicated, excluded just enough to be powerless. I began to realize that silence, in this context, was not neutral. It was active. It was doing work. One afternoon, I overheard two junior analysts talking near the break room. One of them mentioned an audit. The other said, "She'll handle it." They didn't know I was there. The tone wasn't hostile. It was relieved, like passing a heavy box to someone else without being asked. I didn't correct them. That was the moment I understood how deeply alone I was. Not disliked, not attacked, just designated, chosen quietly to absorb what others didn't want to touch. I thought about going to HR. The idea surfaced more than once. Each time, it dissolved under scrutiny. What would I say? That people were being polite? That emails felt wrong? That my name was being used too freely? There was no clean narrative, no sharp edges, just a sense of drift. HR responds to events. not atmospheres. The silence also protected everyone else. It allowed plausible deniability to remain intact. No one had to make a move as long as I didn't. No one had to choose sides. As long as I stayed calm, reasonable, professional, the system could continue exactly as it was. That realization hurt more than anger would have. At night, I replayed conversations in my head, looked for missed cues, alternate responses, things I should have said differently. I wondered when, exactly, my reputation had stopped being armor and started being a liability. When trust had turned into expectation. When expectation had turned into convenience. Daniel told me, gently, that I might be too close to it, that I needed perspective, that I had always taken responsibility too seriously. He said it like a diagnosis, like something inherent to me. You don't let things go, he said. That's both your strength and your weakness. I accepted that framing because it was familiar, because it placed the problem inside me where I had always managed problems successfully before. At work, the silence grew thicker. Meetings where I spoke were summarized without my input. Decisions were announced after the fact. My inbox filled with forwarded threads that ended with, "For your information." For your information. Not for your action. Not for your consent. One Friday, I stayed late to finish a report. The building was nearly empty. The lights dimmed automatically at 7. I sat there in the half-dark, reading through a file that bore my name. I recognized the structure, the formatting, the tone. I did not recognize the conclusions. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair. The silence in the office was complete. No footsteps, no voices, just the low hum of machines doing their jobs without complaint. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Silence was not the absence of conflict. It was the method. It allowed responsibility to slide downhill without friction. It allowed harm to accumulate without resistance. It allowed people like me, reliable, careful, unwilling to make noise, to be used as buffers. No one was going to step in and say this was wrong, not because they agreed with it, but because speaking would cost them something. And as long as I continued to pay the price quietly, there was no incentive for anyone else to do so. That night, at home, I opened my notebook and added a new heading. Not a date, not a time, just a word. Patterns. I didn't know yet what I would do with them. I only knew that silence had already chosen its side, and if I kept accepting it as neutral, it would finish the job it had started. The first real question did not come to me in a dramatic way. It didn't arrive with anger or fear. It surfaced quietly, almost politely, on a Thursday morning while I was waiting for my computer to finish loading. I was staring at the login screen, watching the small circle spin, when it occurred to me that I no longer knew who was actually doing my job. The thought startled me enough that I sat back in my chair. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a suspicion. It was a practical question, the kind I asked for a living. Who is performing which function, and under whose authority? It was the same question I asked vendors when something didn't add up, the same question I asked myself when a process broke. But this time, the question pointed inward. When my desktop finally appeared, I opened the system logs again. I had checked them before, but this time, I wasn't looking for anomalies. I was looking for patterns, frequency, timing. I filtered by user activity tied to my credentials. The list populated slowly, line by line. Each entry was ordinary on its own. Together, they formed a rhythm I didn't recognize. There were actions taken in clusters. Late at night, always within the same 30-minute window. Changes made just before deadlines, just after approvals. Not sloppy, not rushed, deliberate. Someone knew exactly when to step in. I cross-referenced those times with my own calendar, with my phone records, with my sleep app. I didn't want to rely on memory. Memory is unreliable. Data is not. The data was clear. I was not at my computer during those entries. I was not awake. I was not even at home for some of them. That should have triggered panic. It didn't. Instead, I felt something colder and sharper. Curiosity. I asked myself another question then, one I had avoided until that moment. Who benefits from this? The answer wasn't obvious at first. The changes didn't enrich anyone directly. They didn't reroute funds in large amounts. They didn't scream fraud. They softened oversight. They shortened review cycles. They reduced friction. They made things easier for someone. I opened the contract list and sorted by vendor. Daniel's firm appeared near the top, but not at the very top. It was spread out, embedded. Present just enough to matter, never enough to dominate. The same strategy I would have advised if someone asked how to avoid attention. I closed the file and stared at the screen. My reflection looked back at me, faint and warped by the glass. I didn't like where my thoughts were going. I didn't want them to go there. But once the question had formed, it refused to disappear. At lunch, I sat alone in my car instead of the break room. I ate slowly, without appetite, watching people come and go. I thought about Daniel's question the week before. Do you trust me? At the time, it had seemed unnecessary. Now it felt oddly timed. Trust had always been simple to me. You trusted people to be who they had shown themselves to be. Daniel had shown himself to be careful, intelligent, respectful of systems. That was why the idea that he might be connected to what was happening felt so wrong. It contradicted the image I had of him. And I had invested years in that image. That realization unsettled me more than any altered document. Back at my desk, I received a meeting invite for the following Monday. Process alignment, it said. Mandatory. My manager, 2 directors, legal counsel. My name was last on the list. That detail felt deliberate. I didn't ask Daniel about any of this. Not yet. The question I was circling wasn't ready to be spoken. Once spoken, it would change things, and I wasn't sure yet what it would change them into. Instead, I did what I always did when something felt wrong. I gathered information. That evening, I logged into my home computer and pulled public records, consulting firm registrations, board memberships, past employment. I wasn't looking for secrets. I was looking for connections. Daniel's firm had grown quickly in the last 5 years, expanded into oversight, compliance, advisory roles, the kind of work that sat close to power without appearing to wield it. I found nothing illegal, nothing improper, just a pattern of positioning. I told myself that meant nothing. Lots of firms did the same. I closed the browser and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept returning to the same thought. If I were designing this, how would I do it? The answer was uncomfortable. I would place someone trustworthy at the center, someone with a reputation for diligence, someone who didn't make noise, someone whose name carried weight without attracting scrutiny, someone like me. That was the first time the thought landed fully formed. And once it did, it refused to soften. The next morning at work, I tested a small boundary, a harmless one. I delayed confirming a routine approval. Nothing urgent, nothing that would cause problems. I simply waited. Within an hour, my phone rang. It was my manager. He asked if everything was okay. I said yes. I said I was reviewing the file. He paused, then said, "Let's keep things moving." After we hung up, an email arrived. The approval had been pushed through without my confirmation. Under my name, the message was clear. I felt my pulse quicken then, not with fear, but with recognition. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't a glitch. It was a system that had learned to work around me while still using me. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He said he was in the area. He brought coffee. He kissed my cheek and asked how my day was going. I watched him carefully as he spoke. His tone was the same, his posture relaxed, his eyes attentive. I told him about the meeting scheduled for Monday. I told him it felt serious. He frowned slightly, the way he did when he was thinking. "That could be good," he said. "Alignment clears misunderstandings." He didn't ask what the misunderstandings were. I asked him, casually, if his firm had ever worked with internal credentials before. He smiled and said no, of course not. That would be inappropriate. He said it without hesitation, without defensiveness. I nodded and let the subject drop. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, The question sharpened. If not him, then who? I went home that night and opened my notebook. Under patterns, I added a new section. Access. I listed everything that required my credentials, everything that had changed recently, everything that shouldn't have been possible without me. The list grew longer than I expected. I realized then that my problem was not lack of proof. It was lack of permission to myself. Permission to consider that I might have been wrong about someone I trusted. Permission to see my own reliability as something that could be exploited. That was the moment the ground shifted. Up until then, I had believed the situation was external, a system malfunction, a misunderstanding, something that could be corrected if handled properly. Now, I understood that the question was personal. Not what is happening, but why am I the one it's happening to? That question didn't accuse anyone. It didn't assign blame. It simply reframed everything, and once it did, I knew there was no going back to the comfort of silence. I didn't have answers yet. I didn't have a plan. I only had the first true question I had allowed myself to ask. And questions, I knew from experience, have a way of demanding answers whether you are ready for them or not. After the question settled in my mind, everything accelerated without appearing to move at all. On the surface, the days followed the same shape. Meetings, emails, approvals, polite conversations in hallways. Underneath, pressure built quietly, like a pipe sealed too tightly. The Monday meeting came and went without resolution. It lasted exactly 47 minutes. I remember because I counted. Legal counsel spoke in careful phrases about risk exposure and process clarity. A director mentioned recent irregularities without naming them. My manager emphasized shared responsibility. No one accused me of anything. No one cleared me either. The meeting ended with a vague plan to monitor activity more closely. Everyone nodded. I nodded too. As we stood to leave, the director smiled at me and said, "We appreciate how steady you've been through all this." It sounded like praise. It felt like a warning. After that, things stopped hovering at the edge and moved closer to the center of my workday. I was copied on more emails, but asked fewer questions. Decisions arrived already made, requiring only my acknowledgement. Files landed in my queue with tight deadlines and minimal context. If I hesitated, someone followed up. If I asked for clarification, it arrived incomplete. The message was consistent. Keep things moving. I noticed that the changes always favored speed over accuracy. Oversight reports shortened. Review cycles compressed. Exceptions normalized. None of it crossed a line on its own. Taken together, it formed a new standard, one that assumed compliance instead of verification. At home, Daniel's presence became more constant. He didn't ask to stay longer. He just did. He framed it as convenience, traffic, early meetings nearby. It made sense. Everything did. He worked from my dining table some mornings, laptop open, phone calls taken in low voices. I didn't listen. I didn't want to. One morning, as I poured coffee, I noticed his screen reflected faintly in the window. A spreadsheet, column headings I recognized, vendor codes, project names. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was coincidence. Those codes weren't secret. Anyone in the field would recognize them. I turned away before I could see more. At work, I tested another boundary. This time, I documented an objection formally. Nothing dramatic. A note in the system requesting additional review before approval. Within minutes, I received a call. Not from my manager, from someone higher up. He spoke calmly, assured me my diligence was appreciated, then suggested we balance caution with operational realities. The objection remained in the system for exactly 12 minutes before it was marked resolved. Under my name. I stopped testing boundaries after that. Not because I was afraid, but because the pattern was clear. Resistance was absorbed. Objections were rerouted. The system adjusted without friction, and each adjustment left me more exposed than before. The escalation was administrative, not emotional. That was the most unsettling part. There were no raised voices, no threats, no ultimatums, just expectations, layered carefully, until they felt inevitable. One afternoon, HR sent a reminder about compliance training. Mandatory refresher. I completed it at my desk, clicking through slides I had seen dozens of times. Ethics, accountability, reporting concerns. At the end, I certified that I understood my obligations. The irony didn't escape me. I clicked submit anyway. That same day, an internal audit request came through. Limited scope, routine, according to the description. It focused on a subset of projects my name appeared on frequently. I wasn't assigned to the audit. I was asked to provide documentation. I complied. Thoroughly. Carefully. 2 days later, I received a summary of preliminary findings. Language was neutral. No conclusions drawn. But the areas flagged aligned perfectly with the altered notes, the compressed reviews, the after-hours changes. The audit didn't accuse anyone. It simply highlighted process deviations. My role was mentioned as central. I read the summary 3 times. Each time, the same sentence stood out. Reliance on individual discretion appears elevated. That sentence could be interpreted many ways. I knew how it would be read. When I told Daniel about the audit, he frowned. He said audits were political. He said they often needed a focal point. He said it didn't mean anything, unless it became formal. He said not to worry. I asked him, directly, if his firm was involved in the audit. He said no. He said they were aware of it, the way everyone was. He said oversight was cyclical. He said I was overthinking things. I didn't argue. I simply listened. His answers were smooth, practiced. They didn't reassure me the way they used to. They sounded like explanations meant to end a conversation, not invite one. At work, the silence around me thickened further. People stopped bringing me problems. They brought me outcomes. I was informed, not consulted. The narrative forming around me was subtle but unmistakable. I was capable, but perhaps too independent. Reliable, but maybe inflexible. Thorough, but potentially obstructive. Those words never appeared in writing. They didn't need to. They existed in tone, in omission, in the way meetings were scheduled without me and decisions communicated after the fact. I realized then that escalation didn't require confrontation. It required consensus. And consensus was forming quietly, without my participation. One evening, as Daniel showered, his phone buzzed on the counter. I wasn't looking at it. I was chopping vegetables. The screen lit up with a notification preview, an email subject line, a vendor name, a project code. My hands stilled. The knife hovered mid-air. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't read the message. I didn't need to. The escalation wasn't in the content. It was in the proximity. Later in bed, Daniel mentioned that his firm might expand its role with my agency. He framed it as growth, opportunity. He said it casually, like sharing weather. I nodded. I said nothing. Inside, something hardened. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. The house was quiet. Daniel slept beside me, breathing evenly. I watched him for a moment, searching his face for something I had missed. A tell, a sign. There was nothing. He looked exactly as he always had. At work that day, I received a calendar invite for a follow-up audit meeting. My name was included this time. Not last, second. That detail mattered. I understood then that escalation didn't look like disaster. It looked like momentum. It looked like things moving forward without resistance. It looked like my role narrowing until it became a funnel. Everything passing through me, nothing stopping with me. There was still no proof, no smoking gun, no single action I could point to and say this is wrong. But the accumulation was undeniable. The pressure was directional, and it was pointing inward. By the end of the week, I stopped asking myself whether this would resolve on its own. That question no longer made sense. Systems don't reverse without force. Silence doesn't break itself. The escalation had reached a point where inaction was no longer neutral. Staying still meant sliding further into a position I had not chosen, one where my name absorbed consequences while others benefited from distance. I didn't know yet how far it would go. I didn't know what it would cost. I only knew that the careful balance I had maintained for years was gone. And whatever came next would not arrive loudly enough to warn me before it did. The evidence did not arrive in a dramatic burst. It revealed itself the way truth often does, in systems built on quiet adjustments through a detail that refused to fit. It started with a routine request from internal audit. They needed supporting documentation for a subset of approvals tied to the pilot project Daniel's firm had reviewed early on. The request was polite, standard, the kind that usually took me an hour to fulfill. I opened the shared drive and began pulling files, methodically, the way I always did. Halfway through, I noticed something odd. One approval memo, mine, supposedly was missing its original draft. Not deleted, not archived, missing. The version history jumped from a blank template to a finalized document with my signature block in place. That shouldn't have been possible. Our system saved drafts automatically. Even abandoned ones left traces. I refreshed the folder. Nothing changed. I checked the metadata. The document had been created at 11:14 p.m. on a Wednesday night. I had been asleep by then. I checked my phone records to be sure. No activity after 10:02 p.m. I checked my home security app. The alarm had been set. I hadn't left the house. I felt my pulse quicken, but I didn't stop. I had learned by then that stopping too soon only made things harder to see. I pulled 3 more memos at random from the same period. 2 showed the same pattern. Clean jumps in version history. Late-night creation times. My credentials stamped neatly at the bottom. No drafts, no comments, no edits. I sat back and closed my eyes. This was no longer about suspicion. This was about mechanics. I opened the system access logs again, but this time I didn't filter by user. I filtered by function who could create documents directly in final form, bypassing drafts. The list was short. Very short. Most users didn't have that level of access. Daniel's firm wasn't on it. That made sense. External reviewers shouldn't be. But there was a workaround one I had helped design years ago to speed emergency approvals. A service account, dormant most of the time, activated only under specific conditions. When it was used, actions appeared under the credentials of the last authorized approver. My credentials. I stared at the screen, feeling a slow, cold understanding spread through me. The workaround wasn't secret. It was documented, approved, rarely used, and almost impossible to trace if someone knew exactly how to trigger it. I checked the logs for that account. There it was. Multiple activations, all within the same narrow time windows I had noticed before, always tied to projects my name appeared on, always just after I had legitimately accessed related files during the day. Whoever was doing this wasn't guessing. They were following my activity closely enough to blend into it. I exported the logs to a secure drive and printed them at home that night, spreading them across my dining table like a puzzle. Dates, times, correlations. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't opportunistic. It was planned. What unsettled me most wasn't the sophistication. It was the restraint. Whoever did this could have pushed further, could have moved money more aggressively, could have left obvious fingerprints. They didn't. They took only what they needed: speed, distance, plausible deniability. And my name. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Evidence proves what, not who. I repeated that to myself like a rule. The next piece came from a place I hadn't expected. I was reviewing vendor communications when I noticed a recurring email address copied on several threads, an external consultant with a generic name. I hadn't paid attention to it before. Consultants get copied on everything. This time, I clicked through. The email domain belonged to a shell company, perfectly legal, registered in Nevada, no public-facing website. The contact person's name matched the initials on Daniel's phone notifications, the ones I had seen reflected faintly on his screen weeks earlier. My hands went cold. I pulled public records again, this time for the shell company. It had been formed 18 months ago. The registered agent was a law firm in Reno. One of the partners had previously served on the board of Daniel's firm. I didn't need to stretch to connect those dots. They lined up on their own. Still, I didn't confront him. Evidence has a way of evaporating once it's announced. I needed to understand the scope before I said a word. I dug deeper. I compared invoices. The shell company billed Daniel's firm for advisory services. Daniel's firm billed my agency for expedited compliance review. The amounts weren't identical, but they tracked closely enough to suggest a flow. Not illegal on its face, just layered. Then I noticed something smaller, stranger. One of the invoices referenced a project code that didn't exist. It was close one digit off from a real code, an easy mistake to miss. But I knew our system. That code would never pass validation. And yet, it had. Once. Only once. I checked the logs for that date. The service account had been activated. That was the moment the evidence stopped being circumstantial. I sat at my table long after midnight, staring at the papers, listening to the refrigerator cycle on and off. I thought about Daniel's question, "Do you trust me?" I thought about the way he framed systems as tools that distributed responsibility. I thought about how carefully he had positioned himself just far enough away from execution to remain clean. The realization that hurt most was not that he might have been involved. It was that he had understood me well enough to know exactly how to use me without my consent. My reliability, my silence, my instinct to absorb pressure rather than redirect it. Those weren't incidental traits. They were assets. I slept badly that night. When I woke up, Daniel was already gone. A note on the counter said he had an early meeting. The handwriting was neat, familiar. The house felt suddenly larger, emptier. At work, the audit intensified. Requests multiplied. Deadlines tightened. I complied, carefully, providing only what was asked for. I did not volunteer my findings. Not yet. Late that afternoon, legal requested a meeting with me alone. No manager, no director. Just me and a woman I had spoken to only once before. She asked precise questions about process, about access, about how approvals were generated. I answered honestly, narrowly. I did not mention the service account. I did not mention the shell company. I wanted to see how much they already knew. When the meeting ended, she thanked me and said, "This has been very helpful." The tone was neutral, professional. But there was something else beneath it, assessment. I went back to my desk and sat there, hands folded, breathing slowly. The evidence I had gathered was enough to change the direction of everything. Enough to implicate people who believed themselves protected by distance and silence. But evidence doesn't act on its own. People do. That was when I understood that finding the truth was only the first step. What mattered next was what I chose to do with it. And that choice, I knew, would cost me something no matter which direction I took. Because the evidence didn't just expose what had been done. It exposed how carefully I had been placed at the center of it. Once the evidence existed, silence was no longer neutral. It became a choice. I understood that before I understood anything else. I spent the weekend alone, the documents locked in a fireproof box under my bed. I didn't open them again. I didn't need to. The facts were already fixed in my mind. What moved now was something else, my sense of myself, my understanding of what responsibility actually meant when it stopped being theoretical. On Saturday morning, my sister called again. She asked if I was coming out next month like we had talked about. I told her I wasn't sure. She laughed and said I never was. "You always wait until the last possible second," she said. She didn't know how accurate that was. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and tried to imagine what would happen if I took the evidence straight to legal. The scenario played out easily, too easily. An internal investigation would be launched. Quietly. At first, names would surface. Daniel's firm would be scrutinized. Contracts frozen, emails pulled, access logs dissected. Eventually, the workaround would be discovered. The shell company would raise questions. The trail would widen, and my name would be everywhere. Not as the architect, not as the beneficiary, but as the conduit, the person whose credentials had been used, the person who had not noticed, or had noticed too late, the person who had remained silent while systems were bent. Even if I was cleared and that was not guaranteed, the damage would be done. Careers don't recover easily from proximity to scandal. I would be labeled a risk, careful but compromised. Trustworthy, but problematic. The kind of employee organizations quietly sideline. I had seen it happen to others. Good people who did the right thing and paid for it anyway. I imagined confronting Daniel. The conversation, the denial, the careful explanations. He would say it wasn't what it looked like. That oversight was complicated. That he had never intended to hurt me. That he had assumed I understood. He would frame it as a misunderstanding between equals. And then, if pressed, he would protect himself. I had no doubt of that. There was another option, too. One I didn't like. Admitting existed. I could do nothing. I could allow the audit to proceed on its current trajectory. Let it focus on process deviations without names attached. Let it result in new controls, new policies, new training. Let the system correct itself in the vague, impersonal way systems often do. Daniel's firm would adapt. They always did. The shell company would dissolve quietly. The workaround would be patched. Everyone would move on, including me. I would remain employed. Damaged, perhaps, but intact. My name would carry a shadow, but not a stain. I could rebuild slowly, quietly, the way I always had. That option came with a different cost. One that wasn't visible on any report. It meant accepting that someone had used me knowingly, strategically, and that I had chosen to protect the structure that allowed it. It meant deciding that harm without headlines was tolerable. That distance equaled innocence. I had spent my career believing that systems deserved protection because they served the public. That belief was not abstract to me. People depended on those systems every day. Buses ran, trains ran, projects completed, lives moved. If I detonated this quietly contained problem, it wouldn't just affect Daniel. It would ripple outward. Projects would stall, funding would freeze, jobs would be lost. People far removed from any wrongdoing would pay the price. I wasn't sure I could justify that. On Sunday evening, Daniel came over unannounced. He brought groceries, he cooked dinner, he talked about his son's college applications, normal things, grounding things. I watched him move through my kitchen like he belonged there, and I felt something fracture inside me, not anger, not betrayal, but clarity. He did not ask how my weekend had been. He did not ask about the audit. He did not ask if anything was wrong. That omission mattered. After dinner, as we sat on the couch, he said, "You know, whatever happens at work, it's temporary." He said it lightly, comforting. "You're solid. You'll land on your feet." I looked at him and realized he was right. I would land on my feet. The question was whether I was willing to let others fall to keep my balance. That night, after he left, I took the fireproof box out from under my bed. I opened it and spread the documents across the floor. I didn't organize them. I didn't analyze them. I simply looked at them as a whole. The evidence did not demand action. It demanded judgment. I thought about the junior analysts who trusted me to handle it. I thought about the colleagues who had stepped back quietly, grateful not to be in my position. I thought about my mother, who depended on my stability. I thought about myself, 10 years from now, looking back at this moment. I realized then that the moral crisis wasn't about exposing wrongdoing. It was about deciding who I was responsible for. If I acted, I would be responsible for consequences far beyond my control. If I didn't, I would be responsible for preserving a lie that benefited people who had already proven they would use it again if given the chance. There was no clean outcome, no version where everyone was safe and the truth was honored. I slept little that night. When morning came, I didn't feel resolved. I felt empty, drained of the illusion that doing the right thing was a clear path. At work, the audit meeting loomed. My inbox filled with reminders, requests, gentle pressure. I sat at my desk, hands folded, breathing evenly, and understood something that had taken me decades to learn. Morality in systems is not about rules. It's about thresholds. How much harm you are willing to tolerate to avoid causing a different kind of harm. I had reached mine. The decision I made that morning was not dramatic. It did not involve confrontation or confession. It involved restraint. I chose not to escalate the evidence. Not yet. I would not hand it over to legal. I would not accuse Daniel. I would not blow open a process that would consume everything in its path. Instead, I would watch. I would wait. I would let the system reveal its own limits. This was not forgiveness. It was not fear, it was calculation. I understood that by choosing silence, I was complicit in a way I had never been before. That knowledge settled heavily in my chest. But alongside it came something else: control. For the first time since this began, the next move was mine. And whatever judgment history might pass on that choice, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing I believed about myself before this moment was intact anymore. Choosing not to escalate did not mean choosing to do nothing. That was the distinction I held on to as the week unfolded. I arrived at work early the next morning, before the parking lot filled, before the building fully woke up. I logged in and opened the audit portal. New requests had been added overnight. Clarifications. Supplemental files. The tone was still neutral, still procedural. But the scope had widened. Someone, somewhere, was pulling at the thread. I responded carefully. I gave them exactly what they asked for, no more and no less. Every document was accurate, every timestamp verified. I resisted the urge to explain. Explanation invites interpretation. Facts stand on their own. As I worked, I created a parallel record at home. Not copies, summaries, dates, actions, dependencies. I framed everything as process analysis, not accusation. If anyone ever saw it, it would read like what it was: a professional assessment of systemic weakness. That framing mattered. At lunch, I didn't sit in my car. I went to the break room and joined a table where two analysts were eating quietly. I asked about their projects. I listened. I asked follow-up questions. I made notes later. It was the first time in weeks I had placed myself deliberately back into the flow instead of orbiting it. I began to reinsert friction, subtly. I requested clarifications in writing. I asked for meeting agendas in advance. I followed up verbal decisions with summary emails. I didn't refuse to move things forward. I slowed them just enough to leave tracks. The system noticed. By Thursday, my manager asked if everything was okay. He said he had noticed a change in my communication style. I told him I was aligning with audit best practices. I said it calmly. He nodded, relieved to have an explanation that didn't require action. Daniel noticed the change too. He asked if I was tired, if work was still stressful. I said it was busy. He offered to help, in the abstract way people do when they don't intend to. I didn't take him up on it. That weekend, I did something I hadn't planned to do at all. I met with a former colleague for coffee. She had left the agency 2 years earlier, under circumstances that had never been fully explained. At the time, I had assumed it was a better opportunity. People moved on. That was normal. Now, I wondered. We met at a small cafe off the highway, neutral ground. She looked well, rested. When I asked how she was doing, she smiled and said she slept better now. That answer stayed with me. I didn't mention Daniel. I didn't mention the audit. I asked about her departure. She hesitated, then said she had been in the way. She used those words exactly. She said she had raised questions that made people uncomfortable. Not wrong questions, inconvenient ones. They didn't fire me, she said. They just made it clear I wasn't going anywhere anymore. It is bend. I asked if she had ever felt like her work was being used to shield decisions she didn't make. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. Yes, she said. And once you realize that, you have to decide how long you're willing to stand there. I went home and sat with that sentence for a long time. The following Monday, the audit entered its next phase. Formal interviews were scheduled. My name was on the list. So were others, including someone from Daniel's firm. That was new. I attended my interview with legal and audit together. I answered questions directly. I described processes, not people. I explained the service account as a vulnerability that required tightening. I recommended changes. They listened closely, took notes, asked follow-ups. When the interview ended, one of them said, "We appreciate your professionalism." It wasn't reassurance. It was acknowledgement. Afterward, I walked back to my desk and found an email from Daniel. He wanted to talk. Urgent. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. Later tonight, I wrote. When he arrived, I didn't invite him to sit. We stood in the kitchen, the space between us suddenly defined. He asked what was going on. I told him there was an audit. He said he knew, I told him his firm was being interviewed. He said that was standard. I asked him, then, a single question. Have you ever accessed my credentials? He didn't answer right away. He didn't deny it either. He said, carefully, that oversight involved many layers. That attribution in complex systems was rarely straightforward. That intent mattered. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said, that wasn't an answer. He looked at me, truly looked at me. For the first time in weeks, I saw calculation there. Assessment. He asked me what I wanted. The question was almost comical in its simplicity. I told him I wanted distance, professionally and personally. I told him not to contact me outside of formal channels. I told him to route all communication through legal. He protested. Softly. He said I was overreacting. He said I was putting myself at risk. He said I didn't understand how these things worked. I said, I understand exactly how they work. That's why this ends now. He left without raising his voice, without apologizing, without threatening. That absence spoke louder than anything else could have. The next weeks were tense but contained. The audit tightened controls. Access was restricted. The service account was disabled. New approval layers were added. The system corrected itself, slowly, visibly. Daniel's firm lost its expedited status. Contracts were renegotiated. No headlines, no scandal, just adjustment. My role shifted again, this time with intention. I was asked to help design the new controls, to formalize what had been informal, to document what had been assumed. It was an offer and a test. I accepted, not because it absolved anyone, not because it felt like justice, but because it placed the responsibility where it belonged on structure, not individuals. I never handed over my private evidence. I never accused Daniel directly. I let the process absorb what it could handle and left the rest unspoken. Some nights, that decision still sits heavily with me. I wonder what might have happened if I had chosen differently, if I had burned everything down and walked away clean. But I know myself well enough now to understand that clean exits are a myth. There are only exits you can live with. In choosing restraint over exposure, I preserved the system at the cost of certainty. I kept people moving at the cost of absolution. I accepted a version of control that didn't look like victory. What I gained, unexpectedly, was something else. I gained the ability to stand inside complexity without disappearing into it. And that, I have learned, is its own kind of power. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded in stages, quiet and procedural, the way bureaucratic weather changes without thunder. The audit's interim findings were released internally on a Wednesday afternoon. No mass email, no announcement, just a set of recommendations attached to a calendar invite titled Next Steps. The language was precise. Controls strengthened, access restricted, emergency pathways disabled pending review, oversight roles clarified, accountability redistributed. No names were attached to wrongdoing. That was intentional. What mattered was who noticed the shift. By Friday, the tempo of the office had changed. Approvals slowed. Not dramatically, but enough to be felt. People who had grown used to shortcuts began to ask questions again. They asked them out loud, in meetings, in writing, the kind of questions that leave a paper trail. I watched from my seat near the window as the system adjusted to its new boundaries. It resisted at first, then complied. Systems always do, eventually. They don't care about comfort. They care about consistency. Daniel's firm was affected more than most. Their deliverables came back with comments. Their invoices were returned with requests for clarification. Their timelines extended, nothing punitive. Just scrutiny applied evenly, without exception. He didn't contact me. That silence felt different from the others. It wasn't strategic, it was defensive. I found out later, through a third party, that his firm had lost a bid on a separate contract. Not because of the audit officially, but because of alignment concerns. A phrase vague enough to mean anything. Another firm was awarded the work, one with fewer connections and a slower process. Daniel's firm adjusted. They always did. They downsized one department, rebranded a service line, dissolved the shell company quietly, citing a strategic shift. On paper, it looked like growth. In practice, it was retreat. At work, my role expanded in a way that didn't resemble promotion. I was asked to train others on the new controls, to explain why friction mattered, to model documentation that told the truth without telling stories. I did it without enthusiasm and without complaint. The people who had stepped back earlier began to step forward again, tentatively. They asked for my input. They asked for my review, not because I had power, but because I had clarity. There is a difference. I noticed, too, who didn't come back. A director transferred to another department. A manager took early retirement. An analyst left for the private sector. None of these moves were framed as consequences. They were opportunities, fresh starts, organizational evolution. The truth lived between those words. One afternoon, legal asked if I would be willing to brief the executive team on the process changes. I said yes, not because I wanted visibility, but because refusal would have been noticed. The meeting was formal. Slides prepared by others. I spoke only when asked. I kept my answers technical, boring, even. Afterward, the general counsel pulled me aside. She thanked me for my professionalism. She said not everyone would have handled the situation with such restraint. I asked her if restraint was the word she meant. She smiled and said, "Discretion is often misunderstood." And all right. I went back to my desk and sat there until the building emptied around me. The sun dropped behind the depot. The buses lined up and rolled out. Life continued, as it always did, indifferent to internal corrections. At home, the house felt quieter without Daniel's presence. Not lonelier, just simpler. His toothbrush was gone, the guest room untouched. No trace of him remained except a faint memory of his voice in the kitchen, offering explanations that now felt carefully constructed. I didn't miss him the way people expect you to miss someone. I missed the version of myself I had been before I learned how precisely I could be used. That loss was harder to place. Weeks passed. The audit concluded with a final report circulated to leadership. It listed improvements and lessons learned. It did not list failures. That omission was deliberate. Institutions rarely confess. They recalibrate. The report cited individual diligence as both a strength and a vulnerability. I recognized myself in that phrasing. So did others, I suspected. No one said anything to me about it. I returned the fireproof box to the back of my closet. I didn't destroy the contents. I didn't add to them. They existed now as proof I didn't intend to use, a boundary drawn not on paper, but in my own mind. One evening, my former colleague, the one I had met for coffee, texted me to ask how things had turned out. I told her the truth, a narrow version of it, that the system had changed, that no one had been named, that I was still there. She replied a few minutes later, "So you stayed?" "Yes," I typed. I stayed. I thought she might judge me for that. Instead, she sent another message. "Then make sure it changes around you, not just without you." That became my private metric. I didn't speak about Daniel again, not to colleagues, not to friends. When asked, indirectly, why we had stopped seeing each other, I said our paths diverged. That was accurate enough. I heard later that he had relocated, taken a role in another state. His firm continued operating. People like him are rarely undone by proximity to risk. They adapt, they move, they find new margins. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I should have done more, if my restraint allowed harm to slip through in ways I will never see, if choosing system stability over exposure was a failure of courage. Other times, I consider what would have happened if I had gone public. The collateral damage. The innocent people caught in it. The narrative that would have followed me forever, flattening everything I am into a single story. There is no version of this where I am entirely comfortable. What I know is this: the consequences were real, even without spectacle. The system tightened. Shortcuts closed. The ease with which my name could be used disappeared. That mattered. And the people who believed silence would protect them learned that silence is only useful until it stops being convenient. I still work in procurement. I still wake up early. I still drink coffee by the window and watch the city wake. My routines returned, but they are no longer illusions of safety. They are tools. The difference now is that I see the lines I once pretended didn't exist. I know where pressure collects. I know how responsibility migrates. I know how easily the language of efficiency can disguise intent. I am not proud of every choice I made. I am not ashamed of them either. When I look back on that period, I don't see a victory or a failure. I see a correction, in myself as much as anywhere else. The collapse I had expected never came. Instead, something quieter happened. The version of the world I believed in, where doing the right thing automatically protected you, gave way to something less comforting and more honest. And in that space, I learned how to stand without disappearing. The end did not feel like an ending. It felt like a subtraction. Months passed after the audit closed, long enough for the language around it to soften. People stopped referring to it directly. It became that period, or the transition. Systems stabilized, controls held. The work returned to its old rhythm, slower now, heavier with documentation. I adapted. I always did. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. Same house, same job, same quiet routines. But something fundamental had shifted, and it showed up in small, unexpected ways. I stopped volunteering explanations. When someone asked why a process existed, I told them what it did, not why it mattered. When someone complained about delays, I pointed to the requirements and said nothing more. I no longer tried to persuade people that friction was necessary or that integrity would save them. I let the structure speak for itself. It wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. One afternoon, a junior manager asked me, half joking, if I ever thought about writing it all down. A book, an exposé, a cautionary tale. He smiled like it was harmless curiosity. I smiled back and said no. Not because I didn't have the material, not because I was afraid, but because I had learned something uncomfortable about truth in institutions. Once you release it, you lose control over what it becomes. Truth does not remain pure when it enters public space. It gets sorted, framed, used. It turns into leverage for people who were never harmed by its absence. I wasn't willing to hand my story over to that machinery. At home, I reorganized my life with the same restraint I had applied at work. I closed accounts I no longer needed. I simplified. I stopped keeping backups of backups. I threw away the notebook where I had tracked patterns for months, not ceremoniously, just into the trash, mixed with grocery receipts and old mail. I kept the fireproof box, but I moved it deeper into the closet. Not as insurance, as a boundary, a reminder of what I would not do again. Sometimes, I wondered if that made me complicit forever, if choosing silence once meant choosing it always. The answer came unexpectedly. During a meeting I almost skipped. A new compliance officer had been hired, young, sharp, earnest. She asked careful questions, the kind that slow a room down. At one point, she looked directly at me and asked, "What happens when the system rewards speed over accuracy?" The room went quiet. Everyone waited for me to answer. I could have given a lecture. I could have offered a history lesson. I could have hinted at what had happened without naming it. Instead, I said, then accuracy becomes someone's private burden instead of a shared obligation. She nodded. The meeting moved on. Later, she emailed me to thank me for the clarity of that answer. She asked if I would mentor her. I declined politely. I told her she didn't need my version of caution. She needed her own. That was the moment I recognized the final shape of my choice. I was not going to be the person who warned others by bleeding publicly. I was not going to be the moral center of a story that required a villain and a victim to make sense. I was going to be something less satisfying and more durable. I was going to be a limit. Daniel never contacted me again. Not directly, not indirectly. I heard fragments through the professional grapevine. His career continued. Different geography, different branding. The same language, repackaged. I didn't feel anger when I heard his name. I felt distance. The absence of justice in the traditional sense used to bother me. The lack of confession, the lack of consequences that could be pointed to and explained. Over time, that discomfort changed shape. I realized I had been measuring resolution using someone else's scale. Justice, as I had imagined it, required recognition, exposure, applause for doing the hard thing. But the version I lived with did not offer any of that. It offered something quieter, autonomy. No one could use my name anymore without friction. No one could borrow my credibility without effort. I had learned how to withdraw cooperation without making a sound. That skill changed everything. It showed up when a director asked me to just push something through. I said no, simply, without justification. It showed up when a colleague tried to offload risk onto my review. I returned it with comments and no signature. It showed up when I was asked to sit on a committee that existed only to absorb blame. I declined. No speeches. No drama. Just refusal. The cost of that refusal was subtle. I was no longer seen as endlessly flexible. Opportunities passed me by. I was not invited into certain rooms. That was fine. I had learned that proximity to power often comes at the price of being usable. I chose to be less useful. At home, my life expanded in ways I hadn't planned. I took long walks in the evenings. I enrolled in a ceramics class without telling anyone. I sat in silence without feeling the need to fill it. These things would have felt indulgent before. Now they felt necessary. I wasn't healing. I wasn't reclaiming anything. I was simply living without the constant calculation of how my reliability might be consumed. One night, months after everything had settled, I opened the drawer where I used to keep the signed document. It was gone. I didn't remember throwing it away. I must have. At some point, without ceremony, I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space, and felt an unexpected sense of relief. That document had once represented a price I thought I had to pay to remain intact. Losing it did not feel like loss. It felt like release from a story that no longer applied. I understand now that what collapsed wasn't my trust in people or systems. It was my belief that being good meant being available. I no longer believe that. If there is a lesson here, it is not one I would recommend. It does not make for a satisfying ending. There is no moment where the right thing triumphs and everyone agrees it was right. Instead, there is this. I chose not to be a warning. I chose not to be a martyr. I chose not to be remembered for a truth that would have been consumed and forgotten. I chose to keep my life intact. That choice did not make me virtuous. It made me free. And freedom, I have learned, is not something you win by exposing everything that broke you. Sometimes, it is something you claim by refusing to let the world decide what your silence means.